What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we'll be going over some running backs to trade for this week, and we're going to touch on some players that have really nice playoff schedules, just like we did last week, and then we'll go over some of the players you guys have asked the most about for an updated situation on. Before we get into that, of course, have to start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was which wide receiver with at least 40 targets leads the league in yak per reception, and the answer is Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And none of you have gotten that right so far, which is pretty surprising. I'm sure someone will. Today's stat, I'm on the top 15 running backs in PPR scoring this last week. Only one of them did not score a touchdown. Who was it? Okay, I want to start off with a reminder about some running backs with great playoff schedules that we talked about last week. But it's not something where their situation has really changed, and the matchups obviously have not changed as well. So remember, Derrick Henry faces the Jaguars, Lions, and Packers. And given their loss to the Colts this last week, it is now very likely that they're going to be in must-win mode come weeks 15 and 16. Maybe if they'd gone on a tear to end the season, they wouldn't have needed to play their stars in week 16. That is very unlikely to happen at this point. They're going to be having to win in those weeks. And Henry has actually had, two mediocre games in a row. Remember, 2 weeks ago, he had the 68 scoreless yards, 0 targets. That was pretty bad. And this last week, 109 total yards, but only 1 reception and no touchdowns. Not really like a bad game, but that's not that many fantasy points when all these points come on the ground. So maybe if last week his owner was like, no, I'm not trading you Derrick Henry, and he has another week like this, maybe right now is a time to take another shot if you couldn't get the deal done last week. Aaron Jones also faces the Lions, Panthers, and Titans. And what do you know? He's also coming off another somewhat disappointing performance. It wasn't a bad game, but he didn't score as well, and he hasn't scored or been over 100 total yards in back-to-back weeks now, and he has finished as a running back 20 in both weeks. And again, our goal isn't just to make the playoffs. That's obviously the first goal. But there is also no point in making the playoffs if you know you can't win. We want to put ourselves in position to win when we get there. And doing trades for these two running backs in particular is your best bet. They have such nice matchups. They are a little bit, in a valley of their value right now. And so it's a nice time to try and get a trade done. We also mentioned last week that the Bucs have a really nice playoff schedule. We did go over how it's a little bit better for the wide receivers, and especially for Tom Brady as well. But they do face the Vikings, the Falcons, and the Lions. And so, as we've talked about numerous times on this channel, the Falcons seem like a great matchup for running backs. They are not. They are a much better matchup for receivers. But Vikings, good matchup. Lions, good matchup. And then we talked about that Falcons game, how it's probably going to be high scoring. And so the touchdown upside for the running backs is there as well. Now, I don't think anyone should be going out and trading for Ronald Jones. Even if you think that in this last game, he won the job, it's his backfield now. I don't think anyone truly believes that, but if you think that, now maybe it's like a 60-40 split in favor, or even 70-30 in favor of Ronald Jones because he just had 199 yards and a touchdown, well, okay, that's fantastic, but you don't trade for running backs when they have 95-plus yard rushing touchdowns and they have nearly 200 yards and a touchdown. That's not the time when you trade for him, especially since look at the weeks before that. I mean, I know he had the nice game, but in 3 straight weeks, he was playing less than 50% of the snaps. He'd maxed out at 34 rushing yards, and yeah, he went off this week, but you got to realize that he had this really, really long rushing touchdown. I believe it was 97 yards. And so when you remove that touchdown, he only had 95 rushing yards and no touchdowns on everything else, and then only 2 targets. And so if you'd looked at that performance, well, it wouldn't have been something you're going out of your way to trade for. I mean, that's like 10 fantasy points, right? But he has this one carry where they're backed up and he busts out a long run. That doesn't change everything for the season. It may have changed that game. They may have given him more work in that game because of that. But you don't buy high on Ronald Jones after a performance like this, because we know Ronald Jones has had a game like this earlier in the season they're very up and down with their production, who they're giving the ball to. And so I maintain that Leonard Fournette is actually the one you want, just because we don't truly know who's going to get more carries each week, but we do know that Fournette is going to be more involved in the receiving game. We know that one for sure. And so it's possible, like I said, that Ronald Jones is going to get more touches moving forward because of this performance, but I don't think that means you're trading for Ronald Jones. If anything, I think it means test the waters on Fournette. Maybe the Fournette owner does believe that, and they're like, man, I mean, is it time to cut Fournette because Ronald Jones is clearly the guy now? Well, maybe they don't know. It almost all came off like one carry, but the point is, test it. Just see, can I offer like a bench player or two, just guys that are on the fringe of my roster I could even drop maybe, and just see if you can get Fournette, because I don't think you're starting Fournette, but there's definitely a path to where does Ronald Jones get hurt in the next 2 weeks and then Leonard Fournette is a league winner? Maybe. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen because we have no idea, but that is a path. And you want to get players who have a path to being a league winner, because it only takes one play. It only takes one game even. Like, let's say Ronald Jones gets hurt in week 14. Well, now if you're in the semifinals and finals, that might put you over the edge. So just having a player like Leonard Fournette on your bench is very, very important. One final note on the playoff schedules. I want you guys to think about the Monday night game. So obviously I record this on Monday before the Monday night game, and then it goes out 8 a.m. Eastern Tuesday morning. So I do not know what happened in the Monday night game. But David Montgomery is out, so they're going to have to lean on Ryan Nall and Cordero Patterson at running back. I personally hope that they choose to feature Patterson, because I actually do think he's solid as a running back, and he's obviously a great pass catcher. Now, I bring this up because the Bears have a really nice fantasy playoff schedule. And if they don't choose to do that, they choose to keep Patterson in his role, they use Ryan Nall, and they both do bad, then we know that when David Montgomery returns from the concussion, which will likely be in week 12 because they do have a week 11 bye, he's going to be the guy. And we know that if he's the guy, he's getting a boatload of carries, a good amount of work in the receiving game. And if all of his matchups to close the season are really nice, Packers, Lions, Texans, Vikings, Jaguars, all really, really nice matchups, he's a great buy low, especially if the person that has him needs a win now. If they need a win right now and he's on bye in week 11, you're going to get him at a greatly reduced price point, and that's especially good if you don't necessarily need the win. Now, trading for him doesn't necessarily mean you lose, but if you can afford a loss, you think you're making the playoffs, he's a great guy to go after, because, again, if Ryan Nall and Patterson don't do that great, then we know it's Montgomery's job. Now, if Ryan Nall happens to go off, or they choose to feature Cordero Patterson like I'd like to see, well, then we pump the brakes. Because now they might look at that and say, maybe we actually can use one of these two guys a little bit more and only give Montgomery 60 to 65% of the work instead of like 85% that he was getting before. So I just want you to think back to what you saw on the Monday night game, what happened, and adjust your process for David Montgomery based on what you saw on Monday night. Also, kind of going off playoff schedules, I mentioned last week that the Cowboys have a pretty difficult playoff schedule facing the Bengals, 49ers, and Eagles. Bengals not like really a difficult matchup, but 49ers is, and then the Eagles are as well. And I do get a lot of questions about what to do with Zeke since, he hasn't scored or cracked 100 total yards since week 5. And I think it's a really difficult situation. This is not an easy spot that you guys are put in. And I don't think that there is a correct answer. Obviously, he's talented, but this is the perfect example of why situation matters. It is so much easier for a running back to not even be that great, but when they are put into a situation where they are expected to succeed, they've got a great offensive line, they've got a fantastic quarterback, this is a high-scoring offense, the touchdowns come, the receptions come, there are rushing lanes, so you don't have to be that good to produce. But when the quarterback goes down and the offensive line is injured and the touchdowns go away, even an elite running back isn't viable sometimes in fantasy. And if we look at it, he's also not playing as much as we've used to seeing because Tony Pollard has been really good this season. And I'm not saying the Cowboys, should not be playing Tony Pollard. I actually think they should play him more. I think it should be closer to a 50-50 split. But when we look at this for fantasy, we have to just look at it what it is. Zeke is getting 65 to 70% of the snaps. He's going to see anywhere from 15 to 20 touches. Anywhere from 1 to 3 of those will come in the receiving game. And the offense itself is only going to average 17 to 20 points per game, which means there aren't going to be that many touchdowns to go around. So I have him rest of season as a low-end running back too. So do with that what you will. If you're in a league where no one is willing to trade for him at that price point, you keep him. If you think you're in a league where people are willing to pay low-end 1 to high-end 2 numbers, you trade him away. But I think his value is low-end 2, and if it's any different in your league, act on that. Okay, so now we're going to go on to your questions for the week. So I ask you guys each week on Twitter in the comment section, tell me what players you want me to break down further. So this week we have the Colts again, which it feels like we have to do every week. I might retire this whole Colts deal because I basically have been saying the same thing every week. We're going to go over again how it's the same as what I talked about last week. And so if the same thing continues, I'm just going to every week update you and say it's the same. But do that, do a breakdown on Drake versus Edmonds, a breakdown of the Rams backfield, and then I'm adding in Michael Perine because I don't think he's being discussed places enough. We've discussed him for months now, but I want to go over him because I don't think many of you realize that you should be owning him at this point. So let's start off with the Colts. For the second straight week, it seemed like to start the week that Jonathan Taylor was going to have a really nice game. He touched the ball on 4 of the first 5 plays, including an 11-yard reception, and then just like the week prior, he disappeared. This one wasn't because of the fumble. This was because of the play of Nyheim Hines. But the rest of the game, he had 4 carries and 1 target after touching the ball. Like I said, 4 of the first 5 plays, he gets 2 touches in the second quarter, 3 touches in the third quarter, nothing, and that was including goal line carry actually, nothing in the fourth quarter. 2 weeks ago, that was because Wilkins was, I guess, not even doing that nice. It was more because he fumbled, but then they kind of leaned on Wilkins, didn't use Hines, didn't use Taylor. This week, it was Hines that went off. And going into the week, over the previous month, Hines had 2.5 carries and 3 receptions per game. And then all of a sudden he explodes, 12 carries, 5 receptions, 115 yards, multiple touchdowns. This is a committee, and they are just going to use the hot hand every single week. And realistically, you can't watch that game and be upset with the Colts, right? Like, if you're the coach of the Colts, how could you say you would have done things differently? Hines was very, very clearly the best running back on Thursday, and he was the reason they stayed in that game and then pulled ahead. He was very, very clearly their best running back. Now, does that mean he'll be their best running back every week? Of course not. We've seen Wilkins be leaned on middle and late in games. In one of these days, it's going to be Jonathan Taylor's turn. But that's the problem. We can't know who it'll be. It's more likely that they'll use Hines when they're trailing, but that wasn't the case on Thursday. They brought him into the game when they were down like barely any early, but they were never trailing big. And then he actually went off when the game was like tied and they were ahead. So Hines can still produce when they're winning in games because they're not going to ever give him 20, 25 carries. But if they're giving him 12, 13, 14 carries and then 7 targets in the receiving game, that's not what he had this week. But a week like that where he's getting that 12 to 14 carries, those 5 to 7 targets, he's going to be valuable, and no other running back on the team is going to produce when he's getting that sort of volume. And you say, can we predict it? Like I said, no. It is purely hot hand. They're going to go into every week and say, we're going to start. It seems like recently it's been Taylor. We're going to start with Taylor. We're going to give Wilkins some work, Hines some work. Who's producing? Who does it look like the matchup favors? And we're going to lean on that player, rotate the other guys in. And if we can't predict that, that's very difficult for fantasy. So I'm treating this the exact same that I have for the last few weeks. I have Taylor in 1 out of 4 leagues. I have benched him 3 weeks in a row. It's been the correct decision every time. But I'm not even sending offers right now because I know I'm not going to get anything in return in my league. If your league is different and you think you can get something decent, something valuable in return, absolutely, trade him away. But I know that I can't, and I'm pretty sure you can't either. And so he's going to ride my bench and hopes that either he turns things around or maybe there's an injury to Hines or Wilkins and he starts to get more work. But I'm personally not trading him away, even though I have no plans of ever starting him moving forward unless something happens, because I'm not going to get anything in return, so what's the point? Next up, we have the Rams, and we shockingly have yet another committee. This one was to be expected, though. I mean, McVay literally told us in the offseason that this was going to happen, even pointed to the 49ers and said, I want to do that. So we have all 3 of them healthy now. It's kind of been a rotation of who's healthy this season, but right now, all 3 are back and healthy. And so I don't want any of them. You've got Henderson, Akers, and Brown all going to split the work each week. And your guess is as good as mine as to who's going to score. It was Brown and Henderson this last week, but they still used Akers in the red zone. So it could have easily been Akers with one of those touchdowns instead. And so next week it could be his turn. And this is not something where it's just one dude's getting all the goal line work. They're going to rotate all these guys. And that's the same thing in the receiving game. They're going to rotate through all of these players. I think that Akers and Henderson definitely both need to be owned in 12-team leagues, but I would not feel good about starting any of these running backs while everyone is healthy. And I don't expect that to change. This is what they want to happen. This isn't like, oh, the coaching staff's like, come on, guys, someone produce, someone break out here. No, they want this. They want this to be a rotation between all 3 running backs. And so even if one of them is playing well, they need to just start going off to really burn you for benching them. So if you're relying on one of these 3, and it would likely be Henderson at this point, I don't think anyone's relying on Brown or Akers, but let's say you're relying on Henderson as a weekly starter, you got to make a move because you're not going to win your league with Henderson in your flex. You're just not going to do it. Right? And so if you look at your roster and you're like, yeah, I got Henderson in my flex. I'm like 500 right now. I'm not going to win. Don't just give up. Make a move. Make a splash. Do something crazy because you probably only have 1 to 2 more weeks where you can actually make trades. And so at least go down swinging, right? At least try to get some sort of trade, even if you think you're losing the deal. Try your absolute hardest to acquire a stud because look at the difference guys like Cook, Kamara, Kelsey have been making on a weekly basis. Your team could have been pretty bad in these last few weeks, but if you had Dalvin Cook and Alvin Kamara and even Travis Kelsey, well then you probably won, right? I mean, in these weeks where Cook and Kamara are getting 30 to 50 fantasy points, you don't really need that much else from the rest of your team to win. And so I think that's what people get confused about in making these deals. Like, I am willing to trade 4 quality players to acquire one of like Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Travis Kelsey. I did a 4-for-1 for Mahomes because acquiring that one piece that's capable of getting 30 to 40 fantasy points puts you over the edge even if the rest of your team does. There's no point in having a bunch of solid players when one spiked week puts everything over the edge. And I'm not saying these guys are going to have their spiked week in the playoffs, but you need players capable of that and capable of that more than 5% of the time to really win. And so again, if you're relying on a random spiked week from Henderson or even someone like Nyheim Hines, we just saw it can happen. But it's not likely to happen over time every week. And so if you're relying on Nyheim Hines to win you the championship, you're probably not going to win. You could win this year. It could randomly happen in week 16 this year. But what's more likely to happen? It's more likely that these studs are going to post really nice games. And so trade multiple players to acquire them. And remember, Aaron Jones, Derrick Henry are the 2 that I'm looking at for the fantasy playoffs. All right, I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing me talk at length about that because I do it every week. But please, 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 please do not lose your league because you didn't even try to acquire some of these studs. Again, 3-for-1s, 4-for-1s. They're fine trades to do because I promise there's people on free agency. So your last request was to break down the Cardinals backfield. So we have Kenyon Drake, 16 carries, 100 yards, and 1 reception for, I believe, like 9 yards this last week. Then Edmonds, 8 carries, 56 yards, another 3 receptions on 3 targets, I believe, for another 21 yards. And neither of them got into the end zone. The split was nearly identical to what we had seen before the Drake injury. So Drake's gonna get roughly 15 carries or so each week. Basically no role in the receiving game. And then Edmonds is going to get closer to 7 carries, but with 3 to 5 targets in the receiving game. Rest of season, I have them ranked right next to each other. Running backs 23, 24 for Edmonds and Drake. I do have Edmonds 1 spot higher because if we look at the path where each one of them is injured, Edmonds has a little bit more value in that scenario. And plus right now he does have the receiving game role. So even though he's getting fewer carries, targets are worth so much more than carries that I think he's slightly more valuable. But again, it's the running back 23 and 24, virtually identical value. And so I think both are just flex plays moving forward. The final player, again, I added in is a Michael Perine. If you missed it because he was on bye and we didn't really see much news about teams that are on bye, the Jets said that they are going to use Perine as their featured back moving forward. I'm not sure what took them so long, but this is the Jets, so nothing they do should ever surprise us. But if they're actually telling the truth here, then he needs to be added. So last week I had him as the number 2 waiver claim behind Jacoby Myers, right ahead of J.D. McKissic. And I think it's going to be very similar this week. Again, I do the waiver claim article, table, whatever you want to call it, on Tuesdays, and so check that. We can see exactly what I would give up in Fab, exactly what I'd be doing to acquire these guys, exactly what their value is. But I have a feeling, he's going to be towards the top. And Perine, if he is featured, it means that he's going to have a really nice floor in reception. So in PPR leagues, he needs to be owned. And he's going to have a little bit of yardage and touchdown upside that wasn't there before. Again, I know the Jets are trash, but if he's a featured running back, and that doesn't mean 100% of the snaps, 100% of the volume, it means he's going to be out there for like 70 to 80%, hopefully more, but 70 to 80% of the snaps. He's going to be getting a decent amount of carries. He'll get work near the goal line, and he was already getting 2 receptions a game before being featured. If he's going to be featured and getting 5 to 7 targets each week, well, that's really nice. And again, all PPR formats he needs to be owned, even in half PPR. I think if you're in a 12-team or more league, you have to be going after Michael Perine. He should already be owned in every league, but I can promise you he's not. So those are my thoughts on some different running backs this week you should be trading for, as well as my thoughts on some players you guys have asked about. Remember to ask any other questions in the comment section or on Twitter. And if you have, or if you want, I guess, more ideas for players to trade for, you can check out a larger list at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy it. If you did, then how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? But thanks for watching.